then I shall duly sign. I should now like to call upon the auditor to introduce the invited guests to the House.
Our chair for tonight's debate is Juliette Barnes, the winner of the Trinity Women's Open 2018. Finalist of the Trinity IB 2017 and finalist of the Ulster Open 2017. Among many other debating achievements, Juliette has a vast knowledge of libertarian affairs and
I deny it.
And is, some would say, excited for her speech at the end of the debate. Our proposition guest is Professor Gerard Casey. Professor Casey is a professor emeritus at the University College Dublin. He holds law degrees from the University of London and UCD, as well as a primary degree in philosophy from University College Cork, which I presume is under the sea by now. Sorry. An MA and a PhD from the University of Notre Dame and a higher doctorate from the National University of Ireland. He was formerly assistant professor at the Catholic University of America at Washington, D.C. 1983 to 1986, and adjunct professor at the Pontifical Institute in Washington, D.C. Our opposition guest is David Barrett. David has just completed his PhD here in Trinity in party politics on the title The Electoral Impact of Observable Party Cohesion on Liberal. I think that should be in liberal democracies. He has also been an adjunct lecturer within the college since September 2016 in the modules Fundamentals of Social Science, Ethics and Philosophy and Introduction to Social Science. Before I return the floor to the chair, I just want to run through standing orders for tonight's debate. Speeches are 7 minutes in length. The first and last minute of the speeches are protected. After the first minute, the POI may be offered, which is a point of information, which is effectively where you stand up and just offer a short point. Those cannot be offered in the last minute of the speaker's speech. Guest speeches are longer, which 12 minutes in total. So with that, I return the floor to the chair to introduce the first speaker for tonight.
The question for the House this evening is this House would be a Libertarian, and I should now like to call upon the purpose the motion to the House. Here it is.
So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen, and those of you who are neither ladies nor gentlemen, I read in the London Times this morning, so it must be true, that attractive people tend to be right-wing. I'm tempted to believe this, since I receive email every day from Natasha, Sasha, Anna, and others telling me that my photos on Facebook are super cute. Which is a little odd since I don't have a Facebook account. But alas, a look in the mirror tells me not to lay that flattering unction to my soul, and confirms that in accordance with the dictum, again it must be true, from the London Times, my distinct lack of physical attractiveness should place me on the very far left of the political spectrum. Whether or which, I will confess, I am a terrible person. I really am. I'm white. I'm old. I'm male. I'm socially conservative. I'm a Catholic. Or at least I used to be, heterosexual. And the used to be simply is a historical matter and nothing to do with change of proclivities. And I'm a meat eater. And worst of all, I'm a libertarian. Which means that I spend most of my time promoting and defending drug taking, and that's when I'm not actively oppressing the poor, yes. What would life be like without my 20 cups of tea a day, while I grind my heel into the face of the poor and the oppressed of this world? How would I pass a day? Well, no, not exactly. Libertarianism isn't necessarily about drug taking. In fact, the only drugs I take reasonably consistently are tea. And that's about it, really. So if you want to arrest me for that, go ahead. The fundamental principle of libertarianism is actually very simple. The non- or zero aggression principle, as it's called, and this is what it goes like. It says, no one may initiate or threaten to initiate the use of physical force, which is called aggression, against the person or property of another. That's it. It should be noted that what's ruled out by the zero aggression principle is the initiation of violence, such as murder, rape, theft, and assault, all bad things. Libertarianism does not rule out the use of violence in defense of one's person, property, against aggression. You can, of course, waive your right to do this if you wish. You can be a pacifist, but you don't have to be. The practical differences in telling the difference between borderline cases between aggression, which libertarianism prohibits, and the forceful resistance of aggression, which libertarianism permits, doesn't tell against the clear conceptual difference between the two. So as part of one's fundamental freedom, one has the right to defend one's most basic property, oneself, and any other property that one has rightfully acquired. Of course, one may waive that right, as I said, if one chooses, but one is not obliged to do it. And that's it. That's the whole thing. Okay. It's really, really simple. That's it in essence, the essence, the sum and substance of libertarianism. Of course, it has implications for what you can and can't do. There's a kind of measuring rod or canon against which all of your actions, actual or intended, have to be measured and evaluated. And it should be noted, by the way, that the zero aggression principle is a minimal political principle. It's not a maximal moral principle. Okay? In other words, if I say I'm a libertarian, I want to be left alone and I don't want people interfering with my liberty, it doesn't mean that I hate the poor, although I do. I shouldn't have said that, should I? Or you know, whatever. Or that I take drugs or approve of drugs. In fact, I don't. I think it's a really stupid idea, but there we are. I mean, if people want to do it, you know, as long as they're not threatening to kill me or somebody else, I don't really care. Okay? But if I were to, it's just as if I were to say that water is necessary for human life. I hope you wouldn't think I was saying that there aren't more interesting things to drink. Of course there are, right? And that's precisely the libertarian position. So, it is consistent, that principle, is consistent with a variety of moral principles. Utilitarianism, consequentialism, deontology, whatever you're having yourself. Okay? As long as you measure your actions, intended or real, against that principle. And of course, it's consistent with social radicalism and indeed social conservatism. So I have people who are, yes, sir.
In your view, does the non-aggression principle apply to the unborn? Do they count as someone who can't aggress against?
Well, if the unborn, for the purposes of argument, are considered to be human beings in embryonic form, and if you take it that, for example, treating them, they are required to be treated in a way that doesn't aggress against them, yes, unless, of course, it's a case that you are resisting their aggression against you. Sorry?
Order!
Oh, I'm not sure what you're asking me. What do I think? I'm not telling you. Now, libertarianism then, by definition, is the least aggressive and least committal of all the positions that one can take in respect of politics. All other forms of politics are zero-sum power games in which individuals or groups compete to capture and control the coercive power of the state. And like all contests, such as the Eurovision Song Contest, politics exercises a bizarre fascination over its viewers. I actually watch the jury coming in. It's really interesting to see the count. The songs are awful, okay? But the count is fascinating. I mean, who could resist it? Okay? That's another part of my confession. Another reason why I'm terrible, okay? I forgot that. Yeah. It's a bit like reality TV, politics, except, of course, that now I come to think of it, it's exactly like reality TV, except that the participants in this crazy show get to tell you what you can and can't do. And don't disappear from your life when you turn the TV off. Right? If my gang win, that is to say, if I persuade more suckers to vote for us than vote for the members of the other gang, then we get to make the rules and we get to use force to make you obey or else. If the other gang win, then the tables are turned. But in any event, the voting peasantry will be forced to obey whoever wins. As my first head of school said to me when I joined UCD 160 million years ago, Mr. Casey, he said, the basic principle of politics is that the peasant always pays. And the really bad news is, you're all peasants. So am I, by the way. Okay, so you will pay. Anyway, you might say, well, you could vote so you have a choice. Well, you do have a choice, which is to play the game as it's set up, What you don't have a choice to do is to step outside the game and refuse to play that particular game at all, which is what I'd really like to do. Perhaps you think, well, I'm not a libertarian. I reject the zero aggression principle. But here's the question you must ask yourself. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk? No, sorry, that's from somewhere else, right? No, wrong question. The question you must ask yourself precisely is, do I reject the zero aggression principle? And if you do, and remember, if you don't reject it, you accept it. And if you accept it, you're a libertarian. So this is what you need to think about. And this, Dan, this is for you, okay? It's the troublemaker over there who's giving you a hard time. If you reject the zero aggression principle, consider what you're committed to. If you don't subscribe to it, you're willing in principle and in practice to use violence or threaten to use violence against other human beings to force them to act in certain ways, or more often, to prevent them from acting in certain ways. That's what you're committed to. Your willingness to do this, by the way, also has a certain logical consequence, which is you cannot object to others being willing to initiate violence to prevent you from acting in certain ways or forcing you to act in certain ways. And who is to say what those actions might be? If you look around the political landscape at any particular stage, you might think, well, you know, the people who think like me, we're in the majority, so we get to make the laws and that's great, and the other poor bastards have to do what we say. But remember, it wasn't always like that, and it won't always be like that. If you play by those rules, you can lose by those rules. Think about it. Positively, you might be forced to participate, for example, in a war of aggression. Negatively, you might be forced to refrain from, well, I'll let you use your imagination. Okay? Certain entertaining things, which should be done in private. So that's it. Accept the zero aggression principle and become, or recognize, perhaps reluctantly, look into your soul, if you have one, okay? And then ask yourself, am I already a libertarian? I just didn't realize it. Or reject the zero aggression principle and prepare to find yourself at the mercy of the whims of those who are individually or collectively stronger than you wish, with no principled avenue of resistance. Which will it be? Well, you decide.
So, the motion before the House tonight is that this House would be a libertarian. Can you tell I'm speaking really slowly because I don't have much of a speech written? Anyway, so the question is then, would you personally want to live in a libertarian society? Again, speaking slowly because I don't have much of a speech written. But let's think about this for just a solid minute, right? What if you're not the person who has all the roads coming from your house, right? You know, what if, like Liam, you live in Cavan? Liam says, right, that there's 365 lakes in Cavan. He says, one for every day of the year except leap years, he says. But I would honestly posit that those are all probably just potholes, right? And what I would ask is, you know, who is going to fix those potholes in a libertarian state? You know, how is Liam going to ever leave his house again and get to Cavan Town? Those are the real questions, you know? Who's going to fix them? That's what I ask. And I suppose proposition tonight will tell you that it's the market. But I feel like, you know, that's not what I'm supposed to say because I'm on this side of the table. So I'm going to say that it's not the market, and I'm going to come in with a radical idea that it's the state. So to quote James Edward Martin, who I had a conversation with in the ORNL before today. He asked me to quote him. I don't know where he's sitting. You know, as he told me, any political system based on optimism is doomed to fail. And I'm inclined to agree with that principle, you know? So, you know, according to Professor Casey, libertarianism is all about the zero aggression principle, that the state cannot infringe on your personal freedoms. But the thing is that Professor Casey has a different conception of violence and a different conception of defence to me, right? So again, I'm gonna disagree because I think that's also my application on this side of the table. I think personally that if people are born into poverty through no fault of their own, It's no kind of violence to ask for tax from those who are not born into poverty, such that we can help people who are born into poverty to escape that poverty. And I think the idea that it is some kind of violence is absolutely ludicrous. Tax is just not theft, guys. It just isn't, like. So I think to do anything other than believe in a state that supports tax is to accept the inequality that would persevere in society without it. So 3 things tonight. Firstly, people know nothing. A quick detour at the market doesn't care about the poor. Finishing up at the state is literally so good, guys. So first things, people are stupid, right? People are phenomenally stupid. Case in point, we invited Farage to speak to the society this week, right? But really though, people act in complete ignorance of what they need, right? People act ignorant of what they need and ignorant of what others need. Where people have a chance to act such that they can see some potential gain from it, people take it. People make foolish choices all the time, or even choices that don't seem as foolish as they are, right? Any of us can think that we will be protected against various future events that are frightening, right? Like needing healthcare, like losing jobs, etc., like becoming homeless, right? No one considers that these things may occur in their own lives. We think that these things are unlikely to happen to us, and we don't like to think about the fact that they might, and it is this fear that means we don't think about them. You know, we comfort ourselves with the idea that this fear is unnecessary. None of us know that this fear is unnecessary, but we have relative faith that we'll be okay, and in any case, we'll be looked after. Who looks after us? In status quo, it's the state. The difference between now and under a libertarian society is that we don't need to worry about those frightening fears, right? Because presently the state insulates us from these risks, right? Where we fall down, the state, at least in theory, are at its best, which I think is fair for me to assume, given these guys are probably going to tell us about a libertarian utopia tonight, right? I think the state offers us insurance of such as in cases of such bad, scary things, right? We know that we can rely on social welfare, we can rely on roads, we can rely on a police force to look after us. These are all things that we have going for our society because we owe our society a duty and because we get a right from that. We have a responsibility and a right? So we don't have to think then about the risks that we take. And the thing is that while under a libertarian system, it seems all very well and good to say that people can take those risks themselves and that's fine. If you are placed in a libertarian world in which you lack the funds to insulate yourself from these risks, there are no supports to protect you in those cases, right? You're still poor, you still don't have roads coming from your house, you still might lose your job, you still might end up in a really, really, really bad, dire situation. Except in a libertarian world, it is incredibly unclear how you escape that system, right? No, thank you, though I will take one later, right? We think that this means that the most disadvantaged, for whom it seems most expedient because of financial need, to avoid things like paying for insurance, to avoid things like protecting themselves from such fears, right, are most likely to kind of cut these costs, right? This leaves us in a world in which the rich have no duties to the poor, and the poor are left to fend for themselves and to suffer, right? I'd imagine that the proposition will tell us tonight that charity will propel us and that people will still give to charity and that the poor will not suffer. That people are kind and they'll donate and that people, you know, I don't know, act in the interests of other people. People, you know, they're kind of kind, but they're not really that kind now. Like, we could all be out volunteering right now. And here we are at a debate, firstly, but also at a debate of a society that did invite a fascist this week, you know? And I do say that, fully aware that that's also a self-burn. But people have no concept, right, of the duties that they owe, and would make very little effort to fulfill them, I think, if they didn't have to. Why? It's not in their interests if they don't need to, and if they don't live in a state in which they are asked to, right? Now on to the final stop. The state is literally so good. So we all benefit, right, firstly, from living within a state. We all benefit from being able to exchange money for services from, you know, I will say markets are good for that. We benefit from where we are born, we benefit from who we are born to, we benefit from our natural talents. We benefit from the society in which we live to a massive extent, right? We all derive some kind of benefit or our circumstances affect us in some way, right? I think that then we have a principled duty to return this duty to others who live within that state but derive differing levels of benefit from that, right? I think that given that our community and our capacity to depend on each other are what allows us to make use of our talents, or what allows us to make use of the resources that we gain, or what allows us to I don't know, live happy, fulfilling lives, we then have a duty to give back, right? Imagine, right, if the state loved you, gave you what you needed, you know, rocked you in a cradle, looked after you, okay, that was a bit weird. But anyhow, basically, I think that the state massively has a huge capacity to care for people when they end up in dire circumstances. I've run out of time because it seems speaking slowly worked really, really well. So I'd imagine that the rest of the opposition will deliver better cases than I did. But anyhow, thank you for the floor.
Fine words and told on Lizzie Younger to complete the case of the proposition here.
Madam Chair, Mr. Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society. It's always about roads, isn't it? I knew it was going to go, but I'm moving on to, you say people make foolish choices and no one thinks about insuring themselves against losing their job or becoming severely ill. Unemployment insurance and medical insurance does exist, so obviously people do think about this. The fact that some people don't think about it or don't take out insurance against it is a stupid decision, and I don't support that, but they're not harming anyone but themselves, and they don't harm me by refusing to take out unemployment insurance. It's available to them, so to say that nobody thinks that is just incorrect, and to say that charity or people won't be willing to support people, to give money to people who also need it, is also incorrect, I would say. The recently passed US tax law, which decreased corporation tax in the United States from 35% to 21%, that resulted in bonuses of $1,000 in many companies, raises, stock sharing schemes. The employers didn't just keep all of the money for themselves, as this side of the House is going to tell you that people do. We don't have to force people to redistribute wealth. People do it because it is a good thing and it works. And market forces will, it will be more productive if employers share profits with their employees. Libertarians and anarchists are often confused and held to be the same thing by those arguing against the libertarian cause. They're not the same thing, as a libertarian is to an anarchist what a naked person is to a nudist. That is to say that a libertarian point of view would be to argue for severely restricted government, not no government at all. The government's purpose is to protect the individual rights and freedoms of citizens and to protect against other people, not to protect against themselves. He's like, adults don't need protecting against themselves. So I've 3 points in the speech: that the government shouldn't try and protect adults for themselves, and that's patronising and ridiculous; that private enterprise and the free market can be relied upon to provide services more efficiently than the government or the state; and that a libertarian foreign policy would reduce the number of deaths in conflicts worldwide and would lead to more productive international relations. So, paternalistic government policies, such as taxing harmful goods such as alcohol and tobacco, requiring drivers to wear seatbelts, and making motorcyclists wear helmets, are at least somewhat motivated by wanting to prevent people from causing harm to themselves by making stupid decisions. And taking it at their best, that is a good thing. People don't want others to hurt themselves. People are nice, but it's not your responsibility, and it's not your job to stop someone from hurting themselves. I would say respecting people's ability to choose well for themselves is sacrificed for a supposed respect for human life and health. That's not respectful to people, as it violates their basic human autonomy. You can't say, oh, I know so much better than you what you need, or say, I know what's best for you and you don't. That's just patronising. That's not respecting people. That's just treating people like children. You are going to have to shout because I'm very deaf.
In light of the fact that the evidence shows that people don't make decisions in their best interest, which is why we have doctors, lawyers and other experts, do you not think that there is a role for government in pooling the expertise of experts and deciding the framework in which certain activities may operate?
I don't think there's any problem with experts offering advice and being that I don't have a problem with experts, but it's like experts then making laws telling me what to do. is what I would have the issue with. I didn't quite hear you but I will talk to you afterwards, I promise. So as a second point, government waste. I've only got 7 minutes in total, so I can't go through every comparison of the government and the private sector, but I'll try one or two. And my home country, the National Health Service, is held up to be a wonderful, brilliant thing, which it's not a bad thing. As I don't actively want to kill the poor. As I said a couple of weeks ago in this chamber, it's not like I don't want to help the poor. This week it's not like I don't want to kill the poor. But it's the Labour government in 2002 decided, in its infinite wisdom, to split up NHS budgets so that every region would buy things separately, often from the same suppliers. I don't understand how that's a logical decision to make and how any private company would decide to split up a £120 billion budget into tiny sections and therefore reduce its purchasing power with suppliers massively and double their costs in some cases. You have different regions paying up to 10 times as much for cleaning services as other places from the same suppliers for the same quality of service. That's just not logical, and the free market would force that out. But because the government and the NHS is not accountable to the people, and because taxation keeps coming and taxation is theft, it doesn't change. So, as a final point, libertarianism promotes a foreign policy which is less harmful in terms of lives lost than current approaches. As Professor Casey said, the non-aggression principle. If you do no harm to me, then I've got no interest in doing harm to you. So, there's no... Why would the United States having military bases in the Middle East would be like China building a military base in Montana? It's ridiculous. And if they haven't done anything to us first, then why are we getting involved there? Why are we needlessly sacrificing our lives and our money in order for things that don't involve us? North Korea having a military base in Wisconsin, it's ridiculous, but for some reason we don't think that. So, in conclusion, whilst libertarianism, it might not be a perfect political philosophy, no theory is. And there are good enough points about it to make it worthy of support, I think. So, because the state really shouldn't get involved in people's bad decisions which only hurt themselves. And if you're an adult, then you're responsible unto yourself. And the government is far less efficient than the private sector at the vast majority of things. And libertarian foreign policy is more humane and more effective than current methods. I beg you to propose this motion.
For her final words, and call upon David Barrett to continue the case for the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that's the correct greeting and I haven't mortally offended you all. So just before I start on my deeply thought out words, I definitely didn't just write half an hour before I arrived here. I just want to sort of offer a few points of rebuttal to what has been said already. So as well as a few points of agreement, I too really like the Eurovision voting system. There, that's it. We've established common ground. But another one thing, it is probably worth pointing out that partly the reason why, I agree that it's bad for people not to have, say, unemployment assistance or medical insurance or whatever. You see, not everybody can afford, large amounts of medical assistance or unemployment insurance. That's kind of why we have, things like the state to provide such disparities for that. And also with regard to, you shouldn't be, the seatbelt example seems to be a really popular one with people for some reason that always eludes me. And I think it's actually a good example for why things are actually quite interconnected. So sure, the seatbelt thing primarily helps you in that if you're wearing a seatbelt in a car and you're forced to wear a seatbelt, you're much less likely to die. You're also much less likely to kill someone else in the car that you've improbably collided with in this story, right? So, that's what all those ridiculous ads are, where they play sad Samantha Mumba songs. No, thank you, but I will take someone later. Okay, so before I sat down with this debate, I decided to do a little bit of research. I read a bit of the fountainhead and got kind of bored of gaunt faces standing imperiously against the sky, smoking cigarettes and willfully, cooperating for some reason while talking about the paeans of individualism, because you probably shouldn't be talking about the paeans of individualism if you're working as an architect. You, by definition, work with loads of people. But then I discovered something that was much better than the fountainhead at actually explaining libertarianism and explaining why libertarianism is kind of nuts. And that is the world's greatest fan fiction story, which is The Fountainhead Filibuster, Tales from Objectivist Katanga. So in this, Ayn Rand, upon meeting L. Ron Hubbard, it really is good, decides to set up Galt's Gulch in the Congo in the 1960s. And, hilarity ensues. And by hilarity, we mean pain, misery, and death. And that's essentially the fundamental problem with libertarianism. I'm not going to really argue that against philosophical principles of libertarianism. I'm not a philosopher, I'm a political scientist. I care about institutions. I care about sort of like what works and what doesn't work. And the reason why libertarianism is a bad idea is that it basically leads to fundamentally insane and crazy outcomes that we don't want. So I'm going to divide these into sort of like two basic areas. So the first one is don't kill me, and the second one is please don't kill us all. So why would sure, go ahead.
Before the state, do you think people would naturally organize themselves on those basic rules? Do you think the states require it for people to say let's not kill each other and cooperate? Or do you think the state is necessary for that? Curiosity.
I think that states have emerged from something, and yeah, I think that sure, groups do help prevent people from killing each other in the sense of like, sure, gangs also help prevent utter chaos and sure, organization. No, thank you. But yeah, I think the state does help avoid people killing each other. So, and one of the reasons why the state does that is because the importance of institutions with regard to things like trust. Why is trust really important? So basically, we all sort of operate under some sort of presumption as to the predictability of other people's behavior. So this is really important for stuff like political institutions. It's really important for things like finances, and it's really important because we need people to work in recognizable patterns in order to be able to plan our own lives and in order to be able to assemble societies that work. We need to know that that these pieces of paper are going to be accepted as currency. We need to know that this person is who's going to claim to know all of these like inherent archaic codes or whatever is actually going to be able to operate in this court of law, or this doctor has qualifications that he hasn't just made up on the spot. Regulations allow us to plan certainty into our lives, and this is sort of generally no, thank you. And this is sort of generally true. So, and if trust isn't there, society first of all kind of breaks down, and this leads to less good outcomes on a large scale, as well as a small scale. So it doesn't need to create Somalia. So like Robert Putnam, for instance, has a large literature on like just trusting your neighbors, say, in different parts of the US, and finds that outcomes in places with really low trust. So Alabama's a state like that, but so is a state like Nevada, which is quite different from Alabama, have just much worse outcomes than North Dakota and Vermont, which are two of the most trusting states, because people are more willing to engage with their neighbors around them and engage with a broader society, and that's quite important and significant. It's important because in order to avoid a state that becomes inherently tyrannical, libertarianism, I agree, doesn't want to abolish the state, but if you're going to have society that's inherently distrustful, you're going to end up creating what happened in the Fountainhead filibuster of a society that has to be tyrannical simply in order to make sure that people operate under the rules that require that society to function. No thanks. So this sort of leads on to the sort of general point about please no kill everybody. So, and this is the problem that libertarianism has with its sort of big blind side, which is quite important. So, you know, the fact that we live in a global interconnected environment that has the potential to, you know, collapse around us. So, Rand, I keep talking about Rand because most people who are libertarians have at least read Atlas Shrugged and decided at one point that, like, I don't hate this writing style. So, which is quite a statement, I will admit. So this is sort of true both in terms of, like, we live in an interconnected world. It's perfectly possible that while I'm not condoning the US and the Middle East, it's perfectly possible that things in the Middle East might affect things in the States and vice versa. But also in terms of, like, our actual physical environment. So Rand really likes in her books, for instance, descriptions of, like, I look upon this mountain and I see dynamite. I look upon this forest and I see man's creative potential as expressed in logging machines. That actually happens in the Fountainhead. And that sort of actually fits in quite well with what libertarianism actually seems to mean in practice with the think tanks, say, that operate under libertarian guises. So, for instance, we'll take the Cato Institute. So, the Cato Institute, while it says lots of lovely things with regard to, like, drugs on occasion, immigration sometimes on
Point
occasion.
of information.
Sure, fine.
It takes the state to kill people on an industrial scale. State and state conflict has been responsible for 200 million deaths in the 20th century. It takes a lot of industry by gangs in LA to do that.
Yes.
Yes, try to answer that one.
And that, you know, didn't like pandemics alone killed, like, I can't actually remember the exact number.
They're not political.
Pardon?
They're not political.
Yes, but it needed the state in order to try to help resolve it and provide the infrastructure in
Take
order
away from
to...
the 200 million the state killed.
So this is quite important with regard to physical environment. I just want to make this point. This is quite important because a lot of libertarianism in an economic sense basically requires an unlimited amount of resources because of something called the tragedy of the commons, which essentially says that people need to that people will just take and take and take and take unless something is regulated in order to stop them. Someone else will explain that better and have more time. So basically, if you don't have someone to regulate that, we will all eventually die. Maybe not us, but certainly people related to us further down the line that may share some genetic code with us that we may value at some point in theory. So, in short, libertarianism bad. I beg you to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his kind words and call upon Ross Muller to continue the case for the
No bother, thanks very much.
Ross, before you begin your speech, I'd just like to say we're taking 4 speeches for this debate, so if you would like to put your name down to give the 4 speech, just write your name on a piece of paper, decide you want to speak on, and hand it up to the table. Okay. Those speeches are 4 minutes in length. The first and last minute of those speeches are protected. Ross, since this is also your first time speaking in the chamber, you are entitled to what are known as maidens' rights. These are rights where you cannot be offered a POI for the entirety of your speech. If however you choose to waive those rights, you'll be greeted to a thunderous round of applause.
I waive my rights. Good evening, members of the HIST. My name is Ross Malherbe, and today I'll be arguing the proposition that you, the House, should abandon the welfare state and become libertarians. Now, I'm going to be honest. I have a confession to make. When you hear the word libertarian, the image that comes to your mind is one of a flourishing free market of children, recreational nuclear weapons, and Pinochet throwing lefties out of helicopters. But I'm not arguing from that meaning of the word. The word libertarian has a rich tradition in politics, over 2 centuries old, but its original meaning has been co-opted in the last few decades by a group of American free market worshippers, and this new meaning has been pushed by other members of the proposition. Murray Rothbard, one of the most notorious of these faux libertarians, wrote, "One gratifying aspect of our rise to prominence is that for the first time in my memory, we, our side, have captured a crucial word from the enemy. Libertarian has long since been a polite word for left-wing anarchists, but we have taken it over. The people are not interested in liberty, they are interested in property, and they should rightfully be called proprietarians." Now, the original meaning of the word libertarian was also followed by another word, socialist, to distinguish themselves from other authoritarian socialists, such as Marxists. Libertarian socialist was the term used after the word anarchist was banned by the French government. Now that we've gotten that confusing note out of the way, you're probably scratching your head in disbelief. Why is some junior fresh law pol student up here arguing for anarchy? Isn't anarchy chaos? You might ask. And I only really have 7 minutes to make my case, so I'm probably the most potentially radical political belief in the last 200 years, so I'll try my best. Now that we've I think that in order to propose anarchism, I'll have to argue in stages. Firstly, I'll address some arguments against the state in general, specifically the welfare state. Secondly, I argue why libertarian socialism and not authoritarian socialism is the best way forward. Finally, I'll address what socialism is and why we should advocate for it rather than capitalism. To address my first point, many of the opposition will point towards the welfare state as a reason why we need a state. Free healthcare and education is a necessity, and on this point I'm actually happy to agree with you. The problem is why the welfare state exists in the first place. The man who invented the welfare state was Bismarck, and Bismarck, being a monarchist, did not do this because he had some deep... Yes?
Did Trajan not have a welfare state in the Roman Empire?
Jeez, I don't know. I didn't know. Okay, modern welfare state was Bismarck. And Bismarck, being a monarchist, did not do this because he had some deep-found love of the working class. Rather, Bismarck introduced what he dubbed state socialism to keep the working class complacent and dependent on the state after he had feared the results of the Paris Commune and what it could have potentially been. Now in the 21st century, Bismarck's dream of a working class fearful of revolution has become a reality. The state and its laws are created by those in power to keep their power. Every concession, every victory for the working class, labour laws and their protections do make our lives more comfortable. But every cushion the state gives us only makes our Stockholm syndrome worse. And while the state exists, I have no doubt it is better for it to give us welfare than for it to not give us welfare. But the proposition want a capitalist state with no cushions, and the opposition are seemingly very drowsy and enjoy their cushions. When people are dependent on the state is free to do as it wishes. The state pits private sector workers against public sector workers, threatens gutting the precious few concessions that we have, and funds businesses. This is why market libertarianism cannot happen, because cheap government bailouts are in the economic interests of the capitalist class. A supposed free market is not. While I'm not a fan of Vladimir Lenin, as I'll come back to later, he argued in his book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, that free market advocates are largely middle class, the business people who lost out between the merger of the state and capitalism in the 1800s. A world without a state is the only way billions of people without their liberty can ever be free. But this begs the question, why socialism? After all, socialism is responsible for gulags, purges, famines, genocide. All of these tragedies happened under supposedly socialist regimes. And the people who suffered the most were the working classes. This is where I, as a libertarian, differ from Marxists. Mikhail Bakunin, the anarchist thinker, warned about the dangers of the authoritarian socialist movements in the 1870s when he said, if you put the most ardent revolutionary, vested him in absolute power, within a year he'd be worse than the Tsar himself. I think looking at the history of 20th century socialism, that prophecy has been fulfilled many times over. The Marxists will argue that anarchism cannot work and it cannot lead the working class. They will argue that they have had the only successful revolutions. I would say that the track record of Marxism has more than proved that it needs to be thrown into the dustbin of history and stepped aside because the working class should not be its bullet sponge any longer. Even if we brush aside the Marxists, many people will still argue against socialism. Some will say socialism without a state is impossible, but I'd argue the opposite. The word socialism to every thinker from Marx to Bakunin, to Stalin, to Putin means workers' control of the means of production. The difference between them all is what that actually entailed. Marxists think the workers' state should run production for the workers. We believe that the workers should run their factories, run their farms, and have their say. If we point towards real-life examples, we have kibitzim in Israel and co-ops around the world. Studies by the Leeds University Business School have shown that worker co-ops are actually more productive than ordinary businesses. So why don't co-ops outcompete their rivals in a free market? Why are they such a small percentage of actual businesses? The reason for this is co-ops are good for, but they can't compete with profit-maximising businesses because their goal is to share the revenue among the members of the co-op rather than reinvest it and rebuild their business stuff. Sorry, Michal. Why are there such a small percent? Oh, sorry. In a profit-hungry capitalist world, this is tantamount to failure. Yet despite this, we have anarchists stepping into the void that the state and businesses have failed on. Anarchist squats in Greece have filled in the hole that the EU and Syriza can't by taking over hotels and helping migrants re-establish their lives. Libertarian comrades have set up education for women and children in northern Syria, and although the YPG are not anarchist, they advocate a decentralised version of socialism that is inspired by anarchist principles. I have a minute, so. The advocates for capitalism will argue that living standards have massively increased for millions around the world, and we do not deny this. But living standards increased for serfs between 1700 and 1800. They were still serfs. The growth of a fundamentally rotten system based on coercion and based on the masses depending on it is not a healthy growth. And as we have seen from capitalism's business cycles, when shit hits the fan, the weak are the first to go. The strong will do as they must, and the strong will do as they want, and the weak will suffer what they must. We propose an alternative, away with this hierarchy, away with this slavishness. Peter Kropotkin, another anarchist thinker, was questioned by the old argument of human nature. In his essay, Are We Good Enough?, Kropotkin states, quote, "Do we not say continually that the only means of rendering men less rapacious and less egotistical, less ambitious and less slavish at the same time, is to eliminate those conditions which favour the growth of the egotism and rapacity, of slavishness and ambition. The Marxist vanguard party merely continues this egotistical system. The House must be aware that liberty without socialism is a privilege, and socialism without liberty is slavery. And for that, I beg you to propose the motion."
Politically an inspiring part of this island, the only experiment in our world in libertarianism, Northern Ireland, where we have no government to speak of. And it's shit. Now, it was mentioned that politics was like reality TV, and I think there's only one reality TV star in government at the minute. But, so I'm going to make the case for anti-libertarianism. The onus is on this side of the House to prove to you that libertarianism as an ideology is better than the system we have currently, and at no point have I seen them say that it will promote better living standards, and at no point will it really increase freedom in the aggregate for the following reasons. One, the non-aggression principle, which if we disagree with, we're terrible individuals. Here's a simple problem with the non-aggression principle. You're a vulnerable child. You follow the non-aggression principle. Someone decides to break the non-aggression principle. How do you defend yourself? Someone has a gun. You don't. You can't. You're doomed. The state is required to protect all of us. We give up some liberty for greater protection. We cannot always respond effectively to defending our property, which requires a judiciary and our elected representatives to represent us in government. We cannot always defend ourselves. So I disagree with the non-aggression principle on principle that it's a theory. It's not practically applicable. If you want to look at an example of, oh, by all means, Mark.
Anarcho-libertarianism the ugly form of libertarianism?
Oh, by all means, no. As we have seen today, we have 3 separate versions of libertarianism. I was vaguely prepared for this speech, and now I have absolutely no idea how to respond to each headed eyebrow that keeps propping up. But I would like to say that maybe we should get a non-passive aggression principle as well. But I would say, rather than merely adhering solely to the idea of a private sector, free market mentality, I would say that, you know, the only real examples we have of a free market are black markets. For example, the drug market that we all, you know, want to legalize and blah, 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 blah. But the reason we want to legalize those drugs is to regulate them, is to prevent people from making stupid decisions. As we can see, the free market, when left on its own, is simply flawed. The free market can only regulate what it can price. I definitely believe that. Now, the reason the government is important in this is it will regulate these markets and it will promote the interests of the citizens at the expense of the liberty they would have in exploiting their fellow man. Now, I would argue that, as someone from the ghetto, as you can see, the role of public education in allowing social mobility is the greatest freedom of all. That is guaranteed by government. Institutions sponsored by government. Trinity receives a hell of a lot of government subsidies. By all means, my good man, I don't know what I'm talking about.
Northern Ireland and the government specifically prohibited capitalism policies to learn together. Wasn't it exactly the government that was the problem with education, as you pointed out?
Well, I mean, there were still government schools, and you know, I wouldn't want to mingle anyway. I come from a mixed family, and it's friggin' dreadful. So, as you can probably see, I don't have much material, but I've got, you know, a vague sense of charm and wit about me that completely masks my lack of substance entirely. So yes, I would say that quite simply, public education is what allowed me to be here, because obviously anecdotal evidence is the best form of evidence presenting an argument. Now, I think really, if you want to agree that this House believes in libertarianism, I think it's obvious from both the extreme right and left-wing bias of Trinity that that's obviously not the case. We are this House. We don't believe it. I don't believe it. I wish I could believe it. Life would be so much simpler, but libertarianism is so simplistic that it requires no thought whatsoever, though I do acknowledge that thinking is a very bad habit to get into. But if you look, for example, at a moment when the state, you know, we cut this massive state, the overbearing state, the 2008 financial crisis, I remember from the governor of the central bank's report afterwards that they described it as understaffed, underfunded, and having practically no staff there, and they would have spotted the problems emerging in the housing crisis if they had had it. Now, as libertarians, I'm assuming in promoting individual liberty would not destroy the global capital markets. How would you regulate it so that people aren't exploited when these problems are so complex that the average intelligent voter could not possibly understand them without doing a PhD in financial economics? I don't know, but I certainly don't have a clue. No, blah, 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 blah. I'm sure the welfare state's great. You know, I support it. Health. I mean, I have a grandmother. She's all right. She's got plenty of inheritance. Still don't want her to croquet. Kind of. And you know, I think it's the state's role in guaranteeing that, because I don't want to pay for it. What's the last point? The whole serfs thing. Yeah, there was growth, definitely, in the living standards of serfs, but the exponential growth after state-sponsored capitalism is 1,000 times more than what has ever been matched in our human history, and the institutions of capitalism must be sponsored by the state to be protected. That is definitely the only thing I believe. See, I don't know if it's obvious, but I have no beliefs. I have no values. I'm literally just here because I'm an egotistical maniac who claims attention. But basically, I would beg you, on the basis of this vague, ill-prepared and incoherent speech, that this House should not believe in libertarianism, because it is as vague, conflicting and insincere as this speech was. It was all planned, just like the perfect economy.
well thought through, and call upon Owen Dowling to communicate the proposition. Hear, hear.
Before you begin, the two individuals who are giving floor speeches tonight are Mark Hennessy, who is speaking on the proposition. Hey! And Sandy Lee. So, with that, Owen, since this is your first time addressing the House, you are entitled to women's rights. Choose to waive those rights, so we'll give you 2 rounds of applause.
I'm grand. Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, fellow freedom lovers, fellow nanny staters. First and foremost, I know I'm not quite dressed for the occasion, but, you know, I'm a libertarian. I dress how I want, you know? None of you are the boss of me. Right. I'd like to start my speech by dispelling a particular myth about what libertarian is, especially in light of what our last speaker broke up when he said he observed 3 different types of libertarianism so far. Despite what you might think, libertarianism isn't a concrete, set-in-stone ideology. I mean, this can be shown to be evident when you get 2 libertarians to talk to each other. They bicker, they argue, and they both leave, and they think the other person wasn't a true libertarian. Happens all the time, believe me. So, if it's not a political ideology, what is it? Well, in my own humble opinion, I believe that libertarianism is more of a set of different philosophies, principles, and values, in contrast to, say, social democracy being defined as a particular set of economic and social policies and measures. Though there are plenty of philosophers and theorists who could be described as libertarian, such as Mises or Hayek or whoever, libertarianism isn't the product of any one philosopher in the sense that Marxism is the product of Karl Marx. I'll say it again, libertarianism is a philosophy, not necessarily an ideology. Libertarianism, in my mind, is the philosophy which believes that powers, like the government, could be used against the ordinary people of our society and should be deconstructed. Libertarianism isn't necessarily about imposing some sort of anarchy on society, although we observe it can be, but about empowering individuals, their rights and liberties, and striving to create a freer society. What I like to think about with regards to the state, Einstein once famously said, everything should be as simple as it should be, but no simpler. I do not understand how anyone with even the slightest knowledge of recent history could not be concerned about the potential dangers of a big, intrusive, tyrannical government. The only effective and permanent measures to avoid such a tyrannical government, of the likes of the past we've seen, is to strip away the powers of that government. And I can make the... Go ahead.
What freedoms do you want you not already have?
Say that again?
What freedoms do you want you not already have?
Well, that's a really good question. Well, my point is that we can always strive for a freer society. No matter how free you think you are, you can always be freer. Okay, so where was I? Can I make the point that while we may not have a fascist regime in this country, it's far easier to give power to a government which they don't possess than to remove them when they do. And what of modern Ireland today? Ireland is quickly encroaching on the verge of total rule by an alien government in Brussels. We could soon be in total servitude to a European Commission. We could be subscribed to fight for our EU army under the diktat of Eurocrats. And I want to ask you, did the blood of Pearse and Connolly splatter along the Commonwealth of Kilmainham jail just so that we can hand our country over to Belgium? Okay. Yes. As libertarians, we should strive to maintain Ireland and its people's freedom and sovereignty. With regard to libertarian principles, there is none that is more famous and comes to mind more than our non-aggression principle, and we have observed that today in this debate. And just to reiterate, this is the belief that if you aren't doing harm to others, then go ahead. This could be applied to, say, drugs. You know, as far as I'm concerned, drug policy in this country should be as simple as going to your local fast food joint and saying, hey, can I get the amount of heroin, please? Additionally, libertarianism enforces the idea that liberty is not something up for debate or to be decided over, but rather, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, he put it best, perhaps history's most famous libertarian, by the way, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This would be in stark contrast to some contemporary understanding of what is a human right. Right? What? He wasn't perfect. He wasn't perfect. I will admit that. I will admit he's not a perfect individual, but he laid the foundation for perhaps one of the freest societies in history. And although he has his flaws, he should be remembered and regarded as a hero of freedom. So where was I? Sorry, you lost my... Yeah, okay. So this is in stark contrast to contemporary understandings of what is a human right, such as the recent controversy a few years ago, the right to water. We libertarians believe in what's known as negative rights, in that we believe in protecting things that should not be taken away from us, such as life or liberty, rather than the more left-wing idea that, well, just one moment, I'll finish this. The left-wing idea that we should be entitled to certain things, because we couldn't be entitled to anything. We could be entitled to houses and dinners and anything. Like, where's the limit? And when you do that, when you entitle yourself to something, when you say you've a right to this or that, you end up only empowering that government, not take away powers from them. Libertarianism also dwells on the idea of social freedoms, not just social freedoms, but market freedoms, and too is associated with the likes of what's known as the Austrian School of Economics. Without lecturing into too much of what that means, we believe in the idea of equality of outcome rather than the equality no, that's wrong. That's wrong. We believe in the equality of... Am I running low on time? Okay, this concludes my speech. I just want to say I'm founding the Libertarian Society along with my friends over there at the back. Shout out to them. So if anyone thought this was interesting and they want to get involved, please talk to me. And if any of you want to be my Lady Liberty, you can find me on Tinder.
Thank the speaker for his fine words. And call upon Ruth Lennon, or if it's really Lennon, or
my namesake.
to consider the case for the opposition and indeed the debate as well.
Okay. I am speaking opposition in this debate tonight for one reason and one reason only, and that is the HIS gender quota. Putting that aside, additionally, my good friend Mark Hennessy, some of you may know him, but he's a little shy to get up and speak tonight. You're not in time. But he's a really resolute major opponent of any kind of right-wing economics, and I wanted to get up and oppose the things that he opposes on his behalf. Additionally, when I wrote that joke, I didn't realize that Paul was going to give him a floor speech, but whatever. So, on to the first speaker. I do think you suffered tonight from not actually running with the drug-taking angle, which I think would have been somewhat popular given the room, although I suppose we're not the Phil, are we? But the joke's on you, because I actually like violence. So you tell us that we're actually all already libertarians, which is incidentally a clever tactic that Michal uses to try and convince you I'm already a Catholic. I just don't know yet. And you speak of the game as it's set up. So let's bear in mind that, generally speaking, the majority, we are the ones who set up the game, and then you do make it sound as if we burst into your bedroom at night demanding taxes. But you only play the game when you choose to interact with other people within the society. When you buy food, you are interacting with the people who grew it and the people who sell it. When you walk down the street, you're interacting with the people, that's right, who built the roads. I do agree with this first speaker on one thing, which is that he definitely does hate the poor. Lizzie tells us that money will redistribute itself, naturally through the market because people are good. And it is weird how with all our current laws and all our supposedly good people, poverty still exists, but whatever. I am going to make a very similar case to what Queeveen here made, but I'm going to make it and believe it at the same time. And I'm also going to do it in, like a much less aristocratic coat. So on to our third speaker, who brings us a somewhat different case, but I do have to say, when you tell us that people are dependent on the state and therefore it is free to do what it wants, I think you ignore the fact that if we don't have the state, the rich are free to do as they please. Worker co-ops are successful under the current system. When the state is gone, they're going to struggle even more, not less. And I can only presume that the final speaker was attempting to avoid any argument based in consequences or practicality or reality, possibly, by defining libertarianism as a philosophy and not as, an ideology. Right, so on to my actual speech that I had written. The prop tell you it's as simple as it sounds. Freedom means as minimal constraints as possible. Because if there's one thing I've learned in economics thus far, it's that it's all very, very uncomplicated. But the truth is, when you live in a society of people, your choices affect other people. The way that our government functions is by maximizing total choice across all people by limiting the choices of some people in particular ways. Personally, I like my local library. I like that the buildings I enter have a minimal standard of fire and construction safety. I like that when I couldn't afford to come to this college, the government helped me pay for it. If those things make me less free, then I guess I don't care that much about freedom. If they make the people who had to pay the taxes for them less free, I'm sorry that a more fair society is a less free one for you. And I promise that one day I will be the one paying those high taxes, and I will be doing it gladly. I think these things make us more free, not less free. They work to free us from absolute poverty. Minimal constraints sounds all well and good, but the reason we have constrained each other willingly is to lessen the impact of more natural constraints. We live in a hostile world, and we work together to fight off its effects. Of course, we have to have laws to make that work. That's a good thing. And the economics of their side is simply unfounded. So a lack of any laws whatsoever, no work safety, no minimum wage, no child labour laws, it does not leave the poor better off. It traps them even further into poverty than the current system, which I admit, not perfect, does. When the children of poor families don't have to go to school because there's no law mandating it, and cannot afford to go to school because there's no way for them to afford it, they will not. They will work because they do not have a choice. Their lack of education means they will be less valued in the job market. Their lowered value means that they are paid less for their labour. This is what leads to poverty. And handily enough, under hereditary possessions, and I believe what the first speaker called rightfully acquired property, like that, poverty reproduces itself. It will reproduce over generations with absolutely nothing in its way to stop it. I am much less under time than I thought I would be, so I'm going to read parts of my speech I crossed out, which is incidentally about what the lefty extension often is for libertarianism, and somewhat what you gave us. This is the idea that libertarianism prevents discrimination under the law. But the fact is that the government in most cases is just a reflection of what the people want. Bias laws, laws which are based in oppression and not best practice, are a result not of the institution of government itself, but of the people. Without the government to say, I don't know, prevent gay marriage, homophobic people will still exist. And with no government whatsoever to protect minorities or poor people or any of the people who need protection.
Wait, permission.
Yeah, go on, Michal.
Is it not the government that carries out most of those persecutions, though?
Okay. So the government does carry out certain persecutions, but they only carry them out because the people support them, right? And with no government whatsoever, I don't think it's any more difficult for the government to carry out, or for the people themselves to carry out those persecutions with no laws to prevent them. Yeah, ultimately, I think the best thing libertarianism has to offer is the t-shirt I'm wearing, which your librarian got from the lovely folks trying to set up the TLS Society, and then I begged him for it until he gave it to me for my birthday. And it says, "My life, my choice." I don't see how, I'm pretty sure we all have lives currently. We're in the hiss, so out. And I'm pretty sure we all have rights. And I don't think that eliminating the government makes you less free. I definitely think it makes the poor people, you know, much, much less free. So, yeah, I beg you to oppose this motion.
Can I have your phone for timing?
Ladies and gentlemen, what I just demonstrated there was cooperation in a free society. Ruth was not obliged to give me her phone, nor was I coercing her with violence into giving it to me. Nonetheless, I have the phone, and I am being timed for my rather lengthy speech. So I'm here to make the case that will make no one happy, and as such, I'm happy to accept POIs both from the opposition and the proposition, because basically what I want to say is that libertarianism isn't narco-libertarianism, as Queven aptly pointed out, I suppose. But there is kind of a nuance in it. You know, you can have certain safety nets without saying that, or sorry, you can have certain safety nets and not have a situation where you are utterly infringing on everyone's freedom in every possible way. Again, it is, as one of the speakers pointed out, it's like striving for equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcome. Because ultimately, if you have a situation where everyone lobbies to get as much as possible, then you will get a situation where those individuals end up with the most in the pie. Right? If the majority of the society, no thanks, Michal. I don't want to hear out of everyone, Michal, you're not the one. But if the majority want, you know, increased benefits for themselves repeatedly over and over again, then that's the kind of society that we will develop into. And of course, on principle, it is good that everyone has better healthcare, better education access, better equality. It's not the principles that I disagree with, although I'm not sure about my teammates. But the thing is that there are trade-offs in each of these cases. If you subsidize healthcare, then by definition you're not subsidizing transportation. You're not subsidizing something else. And then the second thing is that you're taking away money from individuals for other purposes, because taxing them overtly does have, even though Ruth is an economics student, she didn't seem to read the page where it says, oh, taxation has harmful effects and incentives for labor and innovation. I wasn't expecting her to POI me, but okay, go on.
Mark, are you comfortable there in the dead center?
The dead center. This is advocating for minimum government is far from your I'm a social democrat, but only on occasion. And then I read an economics article, and then I go, maybe this social democratic party isn't so good after all. But yeah, I've wasted most of my speech yelling at Ruth, which is what I typically do in my spare time anyway. But just on government inefficiency, right? Like we do see this in real cases in Ireland too. I mean in Cuivin's case, right? Democracy led to a situation where we have no government, and the reason why we have no government is not because Jerry Adams and Eileen Foster agreed that the best course of action was to have no government for a libertarian system. It's because they don't care about the people they're representing. They're playing a political game. You know, their principles, which they supposedly stand behind, don't incentivize them to actually care for people beyond getting elected. Once they get elected, they're like, oh, well, I mean, I'm just going to let someone else do all the politicianing for me, you know? And then things like Aer Lingus and Bus Éireann, you know, we see these kind of companies who admittedly are government funded, right? But they've never actually they've never been successful. But Bus Éireann was the sole provider, based on a regulation on transport, for 30 years to for example, Cork and Waterford and Wexford. Once private companies came into that industry, prices decreased and times decreased for each of those, for travel times, etc. Like, there are many reasons to support a more nuanced position and not just, oh, let's give everyone everything they want. Thank you.
Can you start timing? So I was only asked to speak about, 25 minutes ago? So I actually don't really have that much prepared. I suppose the effective argument that I will make to the House tonight is this. Libertarianism, if we're looking at it from an economic perspective, as I'm sure Mark would want us to, it doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. Because when we look at things when it comes to, say, organising the economy, we know that co-determination is a better way of doing it than by letting private shareholders control the production unit. We know it doesn't work. Because when we look at certain services like childcare, like healthcare, like housing, like education, we know time and time again that the state provides them better, provides them more efficiently, provides them more fairly for everyone. Don't take my word for it. Look at the OECD statistics that show countries that have a state-run childcare service provide better results when it comes to things like child poverty, provides better outcomes when it comes to things like the cost of childcare itself. When we look at, for example, healthcare, when we look at the National Health Service, a service that literally raised millions of people out of poverty. When we look at things like social insurance, a program which raised millions of people, again, out of poverty in the United States. Every time when we try to actually develop a better standard of living for people, it has always been the state that has done it.
Oh.
Yes.
If the Central Societies Committee didn't allow you to invite Nigel Farage, would you stand up for that decision or would you fight?
The Central Societies Committee is a politically neutral body. I know because I asked them. So yeah, moving quickly on. And look, you know, when we look at things like whether or not state intervention works better, look what happens when the state chooses not to intervene. Look at the Great Depression, right? If you look at the Great Depression, what you will see is states that supported New Deal policies, states in the United States that supported things like the National Recovery Administration, things like, say, the Tennessee Valley Authority, emerged better in terms of standards of living, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of reductions in rates of unemployment, better in terms of things like economic growth than those states that chose to reject them, right? Look to things like Thatcher's policy when it came to housing, a policy that caused the biggest post-war housing crisis we have seen since the Great Recession. Look at things like austerity itself.
Look at, for example, states that introduced austerity policy, states like Greece. Compare them then to states like Iceland. Iceland, which had a larger per capita rate of debt in its economy than Greece, yet still emerged better by choosing not to enforce austerity, reducing government intervention in the economy, than Iceland did. Like, you can see it throughout history. If you look to, for example, the recession in Eastern Asia back in the 90s, you see the same thing there. Which is why what I will say to you is this, right? I don't care about the principled arguments for libertarianism, because if you reduce the principled arguments of any political ideology down, they break down, right? Ask yourself, do you care about doing something to reduce child poverty? Ask yourself, do you care about doing something to reduce consistent deprivation? And if you do, and want to look yourself in the mirror and know that that is something you want to do, then you have to stand in favour against the